Good evening, Dr. Jayaseelan. Welcome to the third lecture of the National Conference on Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Keralam. The moderator for today is Swarna Suresh. She is a PhD scholar of the department and she's working on politics of gunpowder, the changing formation of military and socio-economic relations in South India during the 18th century. Over to you, Swarna, for today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiba ma'am. It is a wonderful evening for a delightful lecture. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us for the third session of the 7-day online national conference conducted by the Department of History, SSUS Kalidi, in honor of Dr. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. Before we move forward with the session, I'll be reading out a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and turn off their video throughout the session. Attendance of the participants will be recorded automatically. If any of the participants accidentally leave and are unable to rejoin the session, they can continue with us through our live streaming in YouTube. Also, if you have any questions in between the session, please send them to the chat box, which I'll be reading out to the speaker on your behalf at the end of the session. Without further ado, I'll invite our PG student, Amrita, to formally introduce Dr. Jayaseelan Raj. Amrita, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening to all. Welcome to our webinar, Critique and Construction, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Kerala. This webinar provides a platform to interact with the new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bringing forward a revised version of existing assumptions and getting into fresh perspectives and conceptualization. In light of the current theme, it is an immense pleasure to invite today's speaker, Dr. Jayaseelan Raj, to speak on post-colonial history of caste and the politics of counter-narrative. Dr. Jayaseelan Raj is an assistant professor at the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, and research associate in the egalitarian project in the development of anthropology at the University of Bergen, where he received his PhD in anthropology in 2014. Before joining CDS, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the London School of Economics and is a co-author of Ground Down by Growth. His main research interests include poverty and inequality, industrial work and social life, caste and class, plantation labor in South Asia, and anthropology of development. Welcome and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the generous introduction. And thank you so much, Professor K.M. Shiba, for this invitation. So the paper is titled Post-Colonial History of Caste and Politics of Counter-Narrative. As many of you might know, I'm not a historian, but an anthropologist, but my basic degree is in history. So I did BA in history from the University of Kerala, then I actually shifted to anthropology. But I do have interest in learning more from history, but also bringing anthropological reflections into historical understanding. So my paper will be oriented in bringing actually a bit of anthropology in understanding colonial history of caste and certain contestations around it. So I'll be largely reading from the paper that I'm writing on post-colonial history of caste, and I will take questions at the end. So the conservative anti-affirmative action groups in India and elsewhere have been arguing that caste system in India, as we understand today, is a colonial invention. Such claims have similarities with arguments put forward by a post-colonial reading of historical anthropology of caste. The post-colonial scholarship provided an academic validation for their claims, although not by intention. The most popular in this literature is Nicholas Dirks' Caste of Mind. Dirks examined how did the colonial bureaucracy reinvented caste as a central category of understanding Indian society. The analytical frame of the book is inspired by his teacher, Bernard Corn, who examined how the colonial state in India reproduced forms of knowledge that fit with the Eurocentric stereotypes, which also facilitated the colonial rule. This version of the historical anthropology of caste, I argue, is contrary to the analysis by that of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, arguably the most popular intellectual statesman in modern India. Ambedkar argued that the historical practice of caste is reproduced by the ritual and customary practices of Brahminical Hinduism. Ambedkar's interpretation of caste emphasizes on its transformative nature in relation to the changing socioeconomic position of ex-untouchable or untouchable in quote-unquote communities. On the other hand, the post-colonial discourse takes a constructionist position, emphasizing the current manifestation of caste to colonial knowledge construction. Ambedkar stressed on the primacy of the practices of common people, whereas Dirks and others focused on the intervention of colonial state. In other words, Ambedkar's argument on the historicity of caste is fundamentally anthropological, that emphasize on the extraordinariness of ordinary practices, while Dirks rely on the historical reading of ethnocentrism of colonial bureaucracy. This lecture places the historical anthropology that Dirks and others proposed in dialectical opposition to Ambedkar's anthropology of caste. In doing so, I argue that Ambedkar's anthropology of caste, which was relatively overlooked by the post-colonial scholarship, is critical to understand the rise of Hindutva and as well as other hegemonic discourses on caste in contemporary India. At the end, I will try to discuss a little bit on Dumontian interpretation of caste in situating Dirks and Ambedkar. Dumont's views on caste, particularly as presented in his Homo Hierarchicus, was often subjected to criticism by the post-colonialist in propagating the colonial construction of caste argument. A discussion of this debate throws light on the significance of examining Ambedkar's anthropology of caste. A major presupposition of post-colonial criticism is that colonial rule has created a cultural break with the pre-colonial period, and that colonial knowledge about the colonized produced fundamental changes in the social life in the ex-colonies. These fundamental changes were instigated by the colonial cultivation of local knowledge, conducive to maintain the colonial rule, and as well as in curbing anti-colonial resistance. This hegemonic cultivation of knowledge by colonial Western eyes is universalized, as argued by Mahmoud Mamdani. This scholarship is part of a larger wave of post-colonial critique of colonial construction of native knowledge, inspired by many, but chiefly Benny-Corn, Michel Foucault, and Edward Said. Scholars roughly inclined to and inspired by post-colonial critique have analyzed colonial and post-colonial situations that ranges from colonial classification of local groups to interpretation of religion and ritual. The post-colonial understanding of caste is internal to this larger project of what Nicholas Dirks refers to as cultural technologies of rule. This post-colonial caste is twofold that are concomitant to each other. The first one is how caste as a major social category was constructed by the colonial regime in India to sustain or legitimize the colonial rule. The second one is how the colonial construction of caste continues to inform the post-colonial politics and society. The history of post-colonial understanding of caste could be traced back to Benny-Corn's analysis from his number of writings on the nature of British's attempt to represent Indian social categories in order to maintain the colonial rule. And these categories include caste, his 1962 paper, political systems, 1962 paper, language, 1985, cloth, 1989, and indigenous law, which is also appeared in 1989. Benny-Corn initiated post-colonial epistemological critique by arguing that the massive survey and census projects of the colonial regime was the recreation of social categories by which India was ordered for administrative purposes. Kohn was not particularly interested in understanding caste system as such in his scholarly interest on India. He was rather interested in seeing caste as an integral element to the political system in pre-colonial period, which was negotiated by the British within the dominant caste of a particular region, of particular regions to maintain their hegemony in that region. This is different from how scholars interpreted Kohn's position on caste as not a fundamental phenomenon that governed the Indian history before the British rule. And this is a quote from Nicholas Dirk's Caste of Mind. Ironically, this position presented as Benny Kohn is not of Kohn's, but of Dirk's. Therefore, it was Nicholas Dirk's Caste of Mind that became a sort of pace setter in the post-colonial interpretation of caste. Dirk's, through a series of writings, examines what could be termed as an evolutionary understanding of caste system by the British colonial officers and missionaries in making an argument that caste as we know today is a colonial construction. And he goes on to the extent of stating that it is almost a colonial invention. According to Dirk's, under colonialism, caste was refigured as a distinctively religious system, and the confinement of caste to the realm of religion enabled colonial procedures to rule through characterizing India as essentially a place of spiritual harmony and liberation. In contrast to the colonial period, Dirk's argues, in the pre-colonial period, the units of social identity had been multiple, and the reference of social identity were heterogeneous and were determined by context. In other words, Nicholas Dirk suggests that caste was just one of the many other forms of identity and a source of imagining a community in the pre-colonial period. Caste was not regarded as something more important than other social institutions, such as religion and kinship, and that it only became central object and primary subject of social classification and knowledge only by the second half of the 19th century. So, to substantiate his thesis on the history of caste, Dirk relies on early colonial writings and practices of Christian missionaries and colonial bureaucracy. According to Dirk, caste was not a major concern in the early colonial writings, which was mostly concerned with military conquest and land revenue collections. Dirk focused particularly on the writings of Christian missionaries over conversion issue and the concern of colonial bureaucracy over land revenue and massive survey. He referred to the journal of Portuguese traveler Barbarossa, a British official Alexander Doe, and French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier to begin his conviction that caste was neither imagined in pure Varna form, nor was it the central base of social relations and classifications in the pre-colonial period. Summarizing the account of Mughal poet and historian Abul Fazl's Aini Akbari, Dirk suggests that it was kin-based social categories, not the caste-based ones, that actually made up the local social order. For Dirk, caste had a floating existence in the pre-colonial society, and the British colonial officials in India had mistaken the role of caste in the pre-colonial period and had produced their own categorical understanding of caste as essential element of the Indian social system. This categorical understanding was based on ancient Hindu texts, such as Dharmashastras, thus mistaking the textual for the actual. This led to the realization of caste in the Indian society through the colonial as well as the post-colonial period. According to Dirk, although the Hindu law book Manu stressed on the Varnashrama Dharma, that each caste is designated with different duties through the life cycles, it is the canonization of text in colonial period which made it Brahminical, that created a space to blame Hindu social order as done by Oriental scholarship, particularly that of William Jones and James Mill. In a way, Orientalists such as Jones and Mill and missionaries like Charles Grant criticized what they thought as the Brahminical domination in Indian society and emphasized on the need for social change. Dirk criticized them, that is early Orientalists such as Mills and Jones, for relying on Manu Dharma in interpreting caste. Dirk states that, in quote, missionaries and officials both viewed caste and Hinduism from a position in which Christianity was heralded not just as the true religion, but as one that allowed for genuine separation between the political and social on the one side and the religion on the other. Thus, caste emerged stronger than ever before from the legacy of Orientalist forms of knowledge, unquote. This recognition of caste was solidified by the census surveyed by the British. The survey helped them to implement the divide and rule policy. Following the 1857 rebellion, the British were in pursuit of finding ethnic communities which were loyal to them, and caste identity became a criterion by which they classify the Indian population. Dirks describes this process as ethnographic state, which was driven by the belief that India could be ruled using anthropological knowledge to understand and control its subjects and to represent and legitimate its own mission. In a sense, this move to understand and categorize caste become more empirical compared to earlier textual orientations. In addition, drawing examples from the assertion of Marathas and colors, Dirks argues that many of the caste groups in the pre-colonial were directly formed out of social classes that made up the feudal groups of the kingdoms of the old regime. But the pre-colonial social history, where caste was less relevant as a social identity according to Dirks, was erased in the institutionalization of colonial rule. Thus, Dirks concludes that caste had not been a key symbol of Indian society and did not form the basis for social relations in India, where Brahmin and untouchable form the two ends justifying caste as a system, as Dumont have argued. For Dirks, the only common social fact of caste is concerned with the codification of kinship relations and to some extent the protocols of Indian interdining. Nicholas Dirks' thesis is that traditional forms of social constitution at some point of time in Indian history was rediscovered by the colonial authority as something that represents the whole traditional India. They accomplished this in order to portray pre-colonial India as a classic example of primitive Oriental despotism and to expose Indian mentality as something stagnated that resists modern change. The rediscovery of caste in Varna order helped to a great extent to sustain the colonial rule in India and also significantly shaped India's post-colonial caste politics. This thesis, articulated in Caste of Mind, was foregrounded in his previous monograph, Hollow Crown, 1987 published, and two major articles, The Invention of Caste, 1989, and Caste of Mind, 1992, where he argued that the social was subordinated, that is, social caste was subordinate to the political, which is kingship, in India until the colonial rule undermined the political power of local kings and asserted the dominance of Brahmins. In other words, caste was reinvented in subverting the power of kings and used caste as a legitimation project for colonialism. Dirks claimed that this was done by manipulating Indian traditions through the oral and textual production for the colonial rule, as theorized in Edward Said's Orientalism. Dirks' writings is subjected to a due consideration here because his writings, particularly Caste of Mind, has become an important symbol for a post-colonial reading of caste, a particular post-colonial reading of caste. So, for example, Dirks' argument finds much appreciation in a book wholly dedicated to a post-colonial analysis of caste, written by Devjani Ganguly, published by Routledge in 2005. Referring to a previous, that is, Hollow Crown of Nicholas Dirks, Devjani Ganguly portrays his writings on caste history as a fine representation of post-colonial, post-Orientalist scholarship. Inspired by Dirks, Ganguly argues that the Orientalist representation of India rendered the pre-colonial political economic formations important in reconstructing an Indian society that was conducive to the colonial rule. Such an argument privileges colonial bureaucratic interventions, colonial knowledge formations, and European categorization of caste above the local social practices in understanding caste practices during the pre-colonial and colonial periods. This anti-anthropological reading of caste history can be seen in the post-colonial historiography of both Nick Dirks and Devjani Ganguly. An anthropological reading would point towards the significance of paying attention to a Dalit-centric understanding of caste that goes beyond mere criticism against Eurocentrism. The post-colonial reading of caste by Dirks is subjected to criticism on other aspects as well. Dirks rely on Colonel Mackenzie's collection to argue that Mackenzie did not find caste as an underlying social identity of Indian society, particularly since he did ethnographic surveys in the Deccan-Mysore region, where the continuity of feudal social order was much stronger than other regions, where British direct rule freezed the pre-colonial history and brought back caste as a major idea. But Nicholas Dirks' use of Mackenzie needs to be critically examined because Mackenzie's assistants were mostly Brahmins, as noted by Dirks himself, who would tend to, the Brahmins who would tend to play down the significance of caste system in the colonial censuses. This has parallels with Indian post-colonial politics, where the Brahmins denied the powerful role of caste in Indian society, especially when the lower caste, particularly Dalits, turned to draw the attention of international community to the continuing caste-based atrocities against them. In addition, this points out to the fact that silencing the past, to borrow from Michel Treux, is not to be blamed on colonialism alone, but needs to be extended to the role played by the native elites in order to produce a distorted knowledge of the past. Although Dirks' account doesn't negate the marginality of untouchables, in quote, and the supremacy of the upper caste that find a place within the caste cosmology, it does not seriously address the plight of untouchables in the colonial period. That is to say, untouchables are literally invisible within Dirks' colonial description of caste. This invisibility strengthens the colonial construction of caste as well. So one could argue that the focus on the colonial construction of caste is a negation of the existence of caste system and thus silencing the oppression of the untouchable communities. This is further evident in the important critique of Dirks' argument by historian Saurabh Dubey. Dubey recognizes Dirks' meticulous analysis of colonial construction of caste. Yet Dubey raises the important question that colonial construction doesn't need to be the Indian practice of caste. In Dubey's own words, an exclusive category or entity of caste instituted by the colonial and colonized alike exhaust the range of expressions of caste in Indian society. This criticism was also shared by Diane P. Mines, as Mines argues that reduction of caste to colonial construction as an ethnographic error because Indians themselves have produced and reproduced in many different ways a reality of caste beyond colonial constructions. Extending this argument, one may suggest that the colonial construction of caste, by sidelining the influence of Indians or of different caste communities who effected on the transformation of caste system, may obscure the history of oppression and bonded slavery of Dalits by the upper caste over centuries. Ronald Inden's Imagining India, published in 1990, had anticipated the post-colonial caste argument presented in Caste of Mind. Although it's only mentioned in the footnote in the book Caste of Mind. Reflecting on the ontological part of Orientalist discourse, Inden focused on how the European imagination of India was obsessed with the category of caste in the construction of India. Inden argued that the human agency of the colonized was ripped off by the European construction of the world of the colonized. However, this post-colonial approach to human agency paradoxically overlooks the human agency of the people who, from an anthropological point of view, are fully capable of refiguring caste relations, which might not be oriented in the directions that the colonizers hoped for. This approach would shift the focus from the ethnography of the colonial state to the ethnography of the colonized, or the historical anthropology of the colonized state to a historical anthropology of the colonized. So it will also constitute the single category of colonized into different caste groups in terms of their varied experience of caste and colonialism, as evident in Ambedkar's conceptualization of caste. I observe that Ambedkar's emphasis on the notion of social is helpful in overcoming a post-colonial understanding of caste. Ambedkar emphasizes on a historical genealogy of social practices, including ritual, endogamy, child marriage, widowhood, and dining, to understand the reproduction of caste as a system. In other words, Ambedkar stressed on the anthropological understanding of caste, emphasizing on everyday social practices of ordinary human beings to consider the significance of caste as an organizing principle of Indian society. This, in fact, points out to the limitations of what I have described as a post-colonial caste that is mainly focused on the colonial classifications available from administrative records and written communications between colonial bureaucrats. Such focus on the colonial classifications and communications falls short of appreciating local practices of caste historically. In other words, Ambedkar's emphasis on the anthropological history of caste helps us to overcome the post-colonial history of caste. So, Ambedkar's conceptualization of caste was aimed at understanding its persistence and the strategies for the abolition of the oppressive system, what he called as annihilation of caste. Ambedkar's understanding lays two self-convictions. First, caste system is integral to centuries-old Indian social system. Therefore, caste discrimination was integral to the Indian social system for centuries. Second, caste functions as an organizing principle of Indian society, and therefore the system as such continues to marginalize the ex-untouchable communities or the Dalits. To be sure, Ambedkar's understanding of caste system was oriented against upper caste Brahminical interpretation of caste as an essential functional system for the reproduction of self-contained village society. Contrary to Dirk's focus on the colonial state, Ambedkar locates the reason for the persistence of caste system in Brahminical text and the associated rituals and social practices. He states that Manu, the Hindu lawgiver, upholded and philosophized caste system, and it became a prescription for the organization of caste society. In other words, for Ambedkar, the production and the reproduction of caste system is fundamentally rooted in the creative engagement of human beings with the Brahminical texts. This creative engagement should be understood within the ideas of hierarchy, power, and value. Ambedkar's critique of caste could be derived mainly from four of his core writings, namely Caste in India, the Mechanism, Genesis, and Development, which is a lecture he gave in the Department of Anthropology in Columbia University in 1916, Annihilation of Caste 1936, Who Were the Shudras 1946, and The Untouchables 1946. Ambedkar, in the paper presented at the Columbia University, as part of the course he took in anthropology, looked into the genesis, development, and mechanism of caste system. He argued that caste system emerged in the Vedic period and has survived to the colonial period. Ambedkar believed in the theory that all of India's current ethnic groups, such as Aryans, Dravidians, Mongolians, and Scythians, migrated to India from different parts of the earth at different points, and they evolved into a peaceful, settled community where ethnic differences were overcome by cultural formations, or heterogeneity of ethnic differences were overcome by cultural formations of homogeneity. So early Indian society was a class-based society where the practice of endogamy was championed by the priestly class of Brahmins that resulted in the emergence of caste system. The survival of caste system, Ambedkar argues, is particularly due to the practice of endogamy. Thus, for Ambedkar, customs of endogamy, coupled with certain practices that strongly assisted endogamy, such as the sati or widowhood and child marriage, facilitated the persistence of caste system in the Indian history. In other words, social institutions and cultural practices were clearly oriented towards the reproduction of caste system in the Indian society. Ambedkar's realization of the importance of such practices as central to the persistence of caste urges the anthropological orientation in his analysis of caste. He repudiates the dominant theories of caste of the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly that of H. Risley, John C. Nestfield, Sennett, and Kaker. For Ambedkar, a major mistake in their analysis is that they had considered caste as an isolated unit by itself and not a group within. Against this kind of singular notion of caste, Ambedkar argues that caste exists only as a relation to each other. As a whole, caste is in the singular number, is an unreality. Castes exist only in plural number. While these were Ambedkar's thoughts when he was just 25 years old, his views on caste became much more radical during the next 20 years after his presentation of this particular paper at Columbia University. In 1936, Ambedkar wrote his most famous critique of caste system, titled Annihilation of Caste, which he wrote for a presidential address of Hindu Reformist Organization's annual conference. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar begins his critique of caste system by arguing that social reform in India was put on hold for India's struggle for independence, where the Indian National Congress was much more concerned about the political reform first. Ambedkar, however, argues that the political reform will not take place unless social reform is put in priority to the political reform, because social order and social divisions are central to any political claims of self-rule. Those who even proposed social reforms confined their criticism to superficial reforms, such as interdining between different castes, leaving out the issue of intermarriage, which is fundamental in order to abolish the caste system. In other words, Ambedkar locates caste system in the social, and the solution he offers is closely related to the transformation of the social. A number of social practices that Ambedkar considered as instruments for the persistence of caste in the Indian history. Ambedkar noted that caste membership is restricted to those who are born within the particular caste. Members of each caste were so concerned with the purity of their own caste, which led to lack of solidarity between different castes. Each individual's responsibility and loyalty is only to her or his caste. That is, individual morality is bounded by affiliation to the particular caste. So Ambedkar mentions that a caste has no feeling that is affiliated to other castes except when there is a Hindu-Muslim riot. Further, none dared to break the caste loyalty, since those who break the caste rules were being excommunicated. That is to say, the threat of excommunication was important social practice, quite interesting for anthropologists. Such practices keeps individual conforms to the caste rules. In a sense, caste fails to succumb for reforms, and the persistence of caste blocks individual freedom, social harmony, and the sense of solidarity. While Dirk's focus on the role of colonial bureaucracy in reinvention of caste system, Ambedkar instead focuses on the role of Brahmin in its invention and reproduction. Brahmins used to be a class who, through the practice of sati, enforced widowhood and child marriage, created an enclosed class that became caste. The imitation of other classes of these customs created a system of enclosed class, which again facilitated the establishment of caste as a system. Yet Ambedkar does not locate caste as class in a conventional Marxian sense, because he was very critical of such an interpretation of caste as a form of class. Ambedkar argued that proletariats in India will not unite since the working class does not see each other as equal due to graded hierarchy of caste. So for Ambedkar, the primary difference between class and caste is that caste is a rigid self-enclosed unit and has lost the open door character of the class system. So this is clarified in his famous statement that caste system is not merely division of labor, it is also a division of laborers. So Nicholas Dirks located the persistence of caste in the political in terms of looking at how concerns of colonial governance reinvented and sustained caste system. Ambedkar, on the other hand, was radically opposed to locating the political above the social. For Ambedkar, the idea of democracy was not merely a political concept, but a social possibility. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar argued that, that democracy is not a mere form of government. Instead, democracy should be understood as a mode of associated living. Ambedkar locates social institutions and cultural practices at the heart of understanding history of caste system, as I mentioned earlier. And this is very important, which is a major difference between Nicholas Dirks and Ambedkar. So Ambedkar's anthropological orientation is more evident in the solution he offers for the emancipation of the lower caste and the destruction of caste. So he suggests that it's important to move away from Vedic practices, which is the only way of out of caste humiliation. Ambedkar questioned fixed racial theories of human society, and he believed that culture, not race, is at the center of categorizing human beings. This emphasis on the cultural, moving away from the racial fixities, further exemplifies Ambedkar's anthropological historical orientation in understanding caste system. In a recent article, Chaires Garza argues that Ambedkar's rejection of a racialized understanding of untouchability is inspired by the ideas of Franz Bauhaus. Ambedkar took 2 courses in anthropology in 1915 and 16 academic year, though he majored in economics. So Franz Bauhaus is a very famous anthropologist who was teaching in Columbia University. So John Dewey, who was an important teacher of Ambedkar, co-taught a seminar between 1913 and 15 with Bauhaus in the Department of Anthropology. So the Ambedkar's anthropological orientation in understanding caste might be inspired by the ideas of Bauhaus and Dewey. So Ambedkar's anthropological interpretation became a foundational critique for what could be called a Dalit epistemology, as pointed out by Aditya Nigam, 2000 piece. And we could also relate it to Kancha L.S. Major contribution called "Why I'm Not a Hindu," and the whole critical examination of how the religious practice of Brahminical Hinduism differs from the religious practices of lower castes, which is based on clan deities. So Dirks' argument also opens up a larger critique of certain variants within post-colonial theory. While the post-colonial criticism points out to how Western-centric philosophical thought and knowledge construction obliterate the role of classes, the preeminence of post-colonial thinking in social science scholarship, particularly in the West, obliterate the most marginalized subalterns' interpretation of the social phenomenon central to their lives, as in the case of Dalit interpretation of caste. The fundamental contrast in the post-colonial theory is between the colonized and the colonizer, the global North and the global South. Although this dual opposition may be helpful in addressing concerns and issues emerging out of colonial legacy, it does not address the social situation of multiple oppressions in the post-colonial societies. This is what is evident from the post-colonial critical reading of caste. So the post-colonial thinking rooted in the notion of singularity of colonizer and the colonized, and the universalizing tendency of post-colonial framework fails to consider the plural aspect of subaltern status in the post-colonial world. Thus, in a way, post-colonial framework of a particular variant operates on the assumption of a singular subaltern, where it doesn't differentiate subaltern groups, which in effect overlooks the dispersed power relations in the global South. Accordingly, the post-colonial and its related project of subaltern studies silences the past of those who are at the bottom end of the post-colonial society, though ironically questioning the Western authority over the lives of global South. The silencing of past and the plurality of subalterns is what Ambedkar emphasized repeatedly in his writings. Dalit communities do not appear much in the dominant themes or thematic objects of post-colonial theory, or what Gayatri Spivak identifies as truly subaltern, women of the urban subproletariat and of unorganized peasant labor. One could argue that the post-colonial framework is concerned with ex-colonized subalterns throughout third world societies, and Dalits are part of that group. This argument does not hold well, since many eminent post-colonial theorists are from India, and caste should have found a place in their rating one way or another, and could have made significant contribution in understanding post-colonial and reframing post-colonial theory. As I mentioned in the beginning, the only way caste comes out in the post-colonial literature is for legitimizing the post-colonial position in general, rather than as a critique of caste system as centuries-old oppressive system. So it will not be an exaggeration to state that the appropriation of caste system into the post-colonial framework seems to be an epistemic violence that the post-colonialists accuse the Western epistemology for. That is to say, while post-colonial criticism focuses on the critique of universalizing tendencies of dominant ideologies of the West, ironically, post-colonial framework of a particular variant, as I discussed, itself becomes a dominant ideology that enforces its particular conception of social processes, as seen here in the case of caste system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful lecture. It was indeed very engaging to learn how the historical anthropology of caste was perceived within the paradigm of politics and academia in post-colonial period. Your lecture today makes an interesting contribution to the idea of caste consciousness among Dalit and marginalized. I personally found the lecture very moving. As quoted by Randolph Brown, a good discussion increases the dimension of everyone who takes part. Thus, with your permission, I'll open the session for queries. Okay, we have our first question from Abdul Basil. He's asking, sir, as mentioned, Ambedkar's idea of intermarriage, how do you see the recent love jihad laws? Do you think that the notion of caste purity has continued in the idea of religious purity? Should I repeat, sir?
Yeah, no, I get it. Shall I answer? Shall I respond now, or?
Yes, sir, sure.
That's a statement. I totally agree with it. I would just add that, it is still can be seen also as continuation of caste purity, because caste purity is related to Brahminical idea of religion, a Brahminical idea of Hinduism, where we can't actually separate religion from caste system, because that's what Ambedkar's idea as well. So in Annihilation of Caste and in other number of writings, Ambedkar actually points out to this inseparability of Brahminical Hinduism and the reproduction of caste. I think that answers the question. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Do anyone have any more questions? Okay, we have another question from Anaga Kambe. Could you please try to locate the ideas of Mahatma Phule in this context, as he is writing in the mid-19th century?
Okay, see, I'm not an expert on, and I haven't read Phule that well, but Phule was one of the early critiques of, both colonial understanding of caste, but also Phule has inspired Ambedkar's approach to caste in terms of locating it in religion, but also in terms of understanding caste in terms of purity pollution. So if you are taking religion, purity pollution, dining, etc., these are social practices to the core. So that leads to my argument that it needs to be seen from an understanding of an anthropological history of caste, because one has to recognize the supremacy of social practices of human beings above the communications of colonial officers or how colonial state thought about these things. So that's how I would relate to Fule's understanding, writings on.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have another question from Abdul Basit. Barring few exceptions, it was always caste Hindus who were the spokespersons of Dalit. Even in academic circle, caste issues are being specialized by those caste Hindus who have never experienced caste discrimination. Why is it that the caste discourse is dominated by the caste Hindus even to this day?
No, I don't know if caste Hindus are the spokespersons of Dalits. And if you look carefully, what's happening in academia for the last few years, particularly, there are massive changes. So you could see that from a number of Dalit scholars, Bahujan scholars are actually leading in terms of leading commentators on caste as well as on Dalit lives. But it is true that it is dominated. So the dominance and the hegemony of upper caste Hindus are not only on the Dalit studies or studies related to Dalits or caste, but all sort of social sciences for that matter, is a fact. So that partly answers the concern that it is they are the one who dominates. They are the one who controls universities, India, as well as South Asian studies centers elsewhere as well. But that also reflects in the particular epistemological critique, right? I mean, that's why we don't see much of criticism against post-colonial theoretical orientations of caste history much, because it may be controlled by caste Hindus. Although I would say that there is really rich critique of this particular post-colonial orientation by Marxist scholars. Okay, so for example, Ijaz Ahmed, although not particularly on caste, but you can take you can read Ijaz Ahmed or Arif Derlich to get inspired, and you could actually, their critique is on the particular South Asian variant of post-colonial theory, and they identify the problematics within that. This is not to negate post-colonialism as such, because that itself is an important critique in many contexts, but one needs to see not this as absolute emancipatory intellectual practice. That might not be an emancipatory one for everyone, and that is pointed out by this Marxist critique. So I think more of such critiques needs to be brought in from Dalits or Bahujan discourses, or someone who is sympathetic to such a critique.
Thank you, sir. Hope that answers Basit's question. I guess to the continuation of Anaka Kamble's question, she's asking what could be the possible reasons for the ignorance of Fule's writings by the post-colonial scholars.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, as I said, they are it's a problem with the way critical studies are oriented, because the critique of Eurocentrism is located in Europe and North America, and that's a major problem. So even something claimed as critique of Eurocentric practices becomes sort of a reactionary. Okay, it's a reaction against Eurocentrism, where appropriating caste as an institution is placed as an instrument of criticizing Eurocentrism, and that has been the dominant practice. And Nergduk's cast of mind and can be actually placed within that, interestingly. Now, that being the dominant practices, it's not only that post-colonial scholars, I don't know how far they were ignorant on Fule's writings, but that is also, I would say that not only Fule's writing, but also Ambedkar's writing, right? I mean, think about subaltern studies. You had to wait until, I think, volume 6th to have something on Ambedkar or Dalits as such. You may find Dalit population being written within or being understood within subaltern studies in the earlier volumes. I don't know, but it's still more like, for me, it's more like a class analysis, on peasantry and all. But less analysis from the perspectives of caste by taking Dalits at the center of it. And that was not happening. That was not happening until recently, when Dalits themselves took up that initiative, I would say, or very few others. So it is not surprising that Fule's writings were ignored by post-colonial scholars as well as by other critical scholars.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We have another question from Akhil AR. He is a PhD student from JNU. Do you think there should be a comprehensive approach which includes the Marxian and Ambedkar perspectives to address the issue of caste and social justice?
No, I think there are actually comprehensive approaches. The well-known one is Anand Tantumre's writing that brings actually Marxian and Ambedkar's understanding. But even at an epistemological level, then there are other issues. Okay, post-colonial theoretical orientation is one of many issues if we take different epistemological orientations in understanding caste. Okay, so how far actually, popular Marxian orientation would really identify the significance of purity and pollution in the reproduction of caste as a system that encompasses class, not the other way around. So Ambedkar actually emphasized on that fact that caste encompasses class, not the other way around. So unless until we recognize that, we will not be able to appreciate caste fully. Okay, so that's very important to remember if whenever we talk about a comprehensive approach, and that is very important. That has been, I think, that we see around, for example, Tantumre, but it is important to realize the potency of caste. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Sri Lakshmi Mohan Das. She's asking how far the colonial education and ideas destabilize the caste position through the upward social mobility of caste, especially certain sections of the Dalit and the Tiya communities.
See, I don't know. I mean, this is an important question, but there are writings already available. For example, Professor Sanal Mohan's book on modernity of slavery relates to the colonial caste practices, but also emancipatory movements that also includes conversion to Christianity, among other things. So, of course, colonial education has helped to destabilize caste position. But, when it comes to academic, scholarly research on caste, we don't have a Dalit-centric understanding of caste, okay, in relation to whatever you are saying, like colonial education or other institutions. That the colonial education is significant for upward social mobility of Dalits, particularly in Kerala, and there are a number of writings on that. But one needs to go beyond hegemonic epistemological practices that looks like emancipatory, but might not for certain communities, and that's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, right, sir. We have another question from Chiryachan B. Mattam. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar criticism on the scriptures is based on Enlightenment paradigm. Do you think liberty and equality will work in Indian context, since we are in a different historical context where these values are not cherished?
Yeah, I mean, annihilation of caste is a teleological text. Ambedkar writes with a purpose. Okay, it's just not an analysis of caste, but it's an analysis of caste for annihilation of caste, right? And of course, you would find liberty and equality at the center of it. And no, I do think that, even if these values are not cherished, but Ambedkar's intervention is the best example to understand that things can be changed, right? I mean, if you are approaching something with a purpose.
Right, sir. We have another question from Meenu Rebecca. She's saying that you mentioned about Brahmin agents, information collectors of Colin McKenzie. Do you see any sociological or cultural differences between these services, Brahmins and the elite, land owning and Vedantic Brahmanhood? Sorry, Vedantic Brahmanhood.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. What is that?
She's saying that you mentioned about Brahmin agents.
Yeah.
Do you see any sociological or cultural difference between these services, Brahmins and the elite, land owning and the Vedantic Brahmanhood?
I don't know. I mean, I can't answer that question. I didn't get it actually.
Okay.
Does it mean, is there any difference between Brahmin and other landowning castes?
I guess so. That's what she's asking. Now, we can move on to the next question, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer.
It's okay, sir. We can move on to the next question. Next question is from Shobna Karanchan. What is your opinion on Buffalo nationalism of Kanchana Elia Shepherd?
I don't know. I mean, these are questions. Okay, yeah, Kanchana. I mean, please ask questions in relation to the lecture, you know. I can't,
Yes.
It's not a general commentary and I'm not an expert on everything, you know.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, we have another question from Sri Lakshmi Mohandas. Did the colonial plantation play a role in altering the caste system and its notion of purity? In your opinion, how did these develop? How did these two developments, that is colonial plantation and the altering of the caste system, stay connected to one another?
Okay, this is also not related to the lecture, but my area of research being colonial plantation, maybe the question comes from there. Yeah, I mean, the colonial plantations did, radically transform the caste practices, okay? Because in plantations, you have a very strong class order, which actually negates a caste order. But in my research, what I found out that, certain ritual purity pollution aspects are suspended back in the plantations, but caste system as such was incorporated into the class order. So the higher the caste, you have higher chance of getting higher in the class order. But stringent caste rules of purity pollution was not applicable in the colonial context in comparison to Tamil villages or villages wherever these workers came from. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Harida Jain. In the past, people from depressed class within the Hindu religion used to convert to other religions in order to escape from the oppression. But in recent times, one could trace the caste consciousness and atrocities of different religions. How would have this situation happened? should I
I
repeat?
don't, yeah, well, you don't need to repeat. I'm just reading it, but I'm unable to understand. I mean, this seems to be a statement first,
Yes.
and asking my opinion on that.
Yes. Probably she's asking your opinion on it, I guess.
No, the first part is clear, but in recent times, one could trace the caste consciousness and atrocities among different religions.
Yes, sir.
And maybe we are tracing out only in academics, okay? And this is, one thing is to have recognized some process in academic scholarship. That is different from the history of practice as such, okay? Or what was the trend? I may disagree. I may say that these caste consciousness and atrocities were there before also. If we have it throughout, then I don't know what is new. I mean, of course, it changes, it transforms.
Yes,
but
sir, yes,
it's important to identify, and that's what I'm trying to say, is that, if we are reading only Nicholas Dirks, it gives an impression that caste was not a major category of identity. But then if you are moving away from that scholarship and try to find it for yourself, you do find that it has a continuity, and it, of course, transforms, but may not be in the way that Nicholas Dirks suggested. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you. We have another question from Abdul Basit. In today's political discourse, caste identities are temporarily submerged under a broader religious carpet. This homogeneous religious identity is pitted against minorities. Why do our Dalit movement fail to cut across religious boundaries and encompass Dalits across religious boundaries in caste, as caste is not peculiar among the Hindu population?
I don't know. I mean, partly this is also not related to the lecture, but I would just, express my opinion on the second half of the question, that Dalits across religious boundaries, and to say that caste is not peculiar among Hindu population, I don't know. I might not agree with that, because, there are population like, even one could say that lower caste populations in other religious context, but Dalits within Hindu religion is a particular group, okay, because it has a particular relation within the religious system, okay, so that cannot be simply replicated somewhere. I do understand that we need to recognize the similarities, but also the differences are very important. That's where I would go back to Dumont's point, that, in order to address caste oppression, one needs to go deeper into it in understanding what are the specificities of it. If you don't understand what are the specificities of caste system, we will not understand its implications, to put it simply, okay, in the way it actually reproduces itself. Okay, then we would just claim that, okay, we have Dalits in Japan, we have Dalits in Europe, maybe a Dalit-like situation. It is not Dalit situation. I would disagree with that part, although I'm very sympathetic to the question you asked.
Thank you, sir. I guess we are here at the end of the discussion session. It was indeed a wonderful discussion.
Jayaseelan, I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry.
Swarna, can I intervene?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. My question is, since we were also talking about whether it's the Dalits who are writing about the Dalits or whether it's somebody else representing them, how much of a possibility do you see in a standpoint epistemology, so that it need not essentially be a Dalit who's talking about Dalit politics and histories?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky thing. That's a dilemma, right? I mean, that's one thing we are constantly struggling with. So we don't know when is, of course, as scholars, everyone has right to write or critically engage with and being part of extending solidarity to anyone. but where is the boundary between extending solidarity and taking over the leadership? So for example, when this particular post-colonial variant of understanding caste is one of many examples of critical scholarship within which a particular understanding of caste was projected, which is, as a critique of Eurocentrism, but which actually, ignored a Dalit-centric understanding of caste, which is very important to understand caste, just as how a women-centric understanding of gender or a Black-centric understanding of race, right? Now, the question is, what is the dilemma? But we need to look at the history, why it didn't happen. So for example, why we had to wait until 6th volume of Subaltern Studies to hear about Ambedkar. Why is that? Even when we were talking about subaltern studies, subalterns in the 80s, why we failed to capture real subalterns? And that actually opens up a series of contradictions within critical scholarship, where scholars try to represent marginalized communities through their scholarship, but that becomes a form of epistemic violence against that community. So I think, I don't know if it is possible for an upper caste person to write something like a Dalit-centric understanding of caste. Maybe it's possible, maybe not. But I think any sort of discussion needs to take all these contradictions in the contemporary history or anthropology or sociology scholarships, all these contradictions. I don't know if that answers your
Yes,
question.
thank you. I think, then it's basically a question of the experience, whether that experience counts or not, whether we have the experience, or, I think it's a long debate that, Gopal Guru had also initiated.
Yes. Yeah, it is experience.
Yeah. My second question.
Yes.
Yeah, you were saying something.
No, please go ahead. No, yeah, experience is important, but
my second question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that it is very important to recognize that, when various Dalit Bahujan groups, when they were objecting to certain kind of writing, it actually, most often it doesn't actually come from this negation that, you are from that particular caste, so you can't write. Most of the time, the contestation was over the content, but they were accused of bringing that experience and identity element. I'm just particularly referring to Arundhati Roy's introduction to Annihilation of Caste. And most critiques actually was oriented towards the contradictions within the contents rather than the identity of the writer. But those who supported the writer were constantly saying, arguing that, they were only referring to the identity. That again, I would say an epistemic violence, which doesn't see the scholarship and scholarly credential and scholarly critique of such a representation. It's not simply a sort of a politics. It's not narrow-minded politics, Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My second question is, we have talked about Ambedkar, within, a counter-narrative space. Is it possible to also think about Fanon, for example, where race and class, as a model for a theorization in the Indian context?
Absolutely, because Fanon emphasized on experience, right? I mean, of course, Fanon has said many things, but for the current discussion or the discussions we are having, I think, the Fanon's emphasize on the experience and subjectivity, it could be a technical tool for us to expand on our understanding of caste experiences and how lower caste and Dalit would imagine or would understand actually caste as a system. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, sir. It was indeed a wonderful discussion. Thank you for answering all of the questions so patiently, even though some of the
Thank you for that.
are related to your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, participants, for your vibrant interactions. Now, I would like to invite our MPhil student, Janisha AC, for the word of thanks. Over to you, Janisha.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very proud to have had the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to our speaker, Dr. Jayaseelan Raj, for a very informative and remarkable lecture presented here. Thank you, sir. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, I sincerely thank all the participants for your valuable presence. Thanks again to each and everyone. Thank you. Especially thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful session, Dr. Jayaseelan Raj. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really, really happy that you have wonderful group of students taking responsibilities in the organization. It would have been really nice to visit the department again, as I did few years back.
Yes, and, please do.
Yes, we will be able to do that hopefully once this COVID thing is over. Yeah.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. So we meet again on Monday, same time, 6 p.m. for Dr. John Thomas' lecture. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Jayaseelan.
Thank you so much. Bye.